The virtual library is a metaphor. And before I can really talk about how the library functions within the Macintosh environment, what I thought I'd talk about is the nature of metaphor in a general sense, particularly how metaphor and technology have been interrelated. There's an anecdote that was used by the philosopher Sextus Empiricus in his book about skeptical philosophy. Sextus Empiricus was talking about a psychological phenomena that is known, that he coined the word ataraxia in order to illustrate a calmness. And he said that the skeptical philosophers in the beginning were attempting to achieve a state of mind in which the discrepancies between objects of thought and objects of sense could be reconciled. And eventually they found that by shrugging their shoulders and ignoring the discrepancies and ignoring the contradictions, they were able to find this peaceful state of non-judgment, a suspension of judgment. And at the beginning of his text, he illustrates this concept with an anecdote about Apelles. And Apelles was the court painter for Alexander the Great. And the court painter's chief function was to document the exploits of his king. And at one point, he was attempting to paint a painting which was the act of the king in a battle. And within that battle, he was trying to capture the froth that was issuing from the mouth of a horse. And he failed to do so, and he was quite frustrated. So eventually he took a sponge and just dabbed at the horse's mouth to mark the place where sometime in the future he would attempt to paint the froth. Paradoxically, daubing with the sponge caused the froth to look perfect, and he was surprised. The philosopher Sextus Empiricus says this is an example of the state of ataraxia, the accidental discovery of the perfect image. Well, the reason I'm starting with that idea is what Sextus Empiricus does. Sextus Empiricus uses the technology of the time as a metaphor for a philosophical concept. And so the history of this use of metaphor, the history of the interface between technology and human beings, I think illustrates the evolution of culture. So what I've done today is I've prepared a description of my virtual library in terms of the implications of computer teaching and computer learning. And I'm beginning with a very simple idea, and that is the scenarios we have used to describe our pursuit of knowledge, the images we find for places where knowledge is stored, and the narratives we create to illustrate the passage of knowledge from one generation to the next all evolve along with technology. Now, this evolution of technology is rapid, and the rapid evolution of computer technology demands that we as educators revise our teaching theory if our students are going to participate in what Stuart Brand calls coevolution. The recent history of computer user interface may be used as a metaphor for cultural evolution. The change from command-driven to menu-driven to icon-driven interfaces reflects in microcosm the transformation of the magical worldview to the scientific worldview to the post-industrial worldview. That idea, the idea of an evolution of metaphor, becomes what I call an epistemological metaphor. In other words, epistemology as a theory of knowledge is reflected in our use of metaphor. And it's particularly reflected in the history of what's come to be known as the computer interface, the relationship between what's actually going on within the guts of the computer and what's going on in the mind of the user. And so what I've prepared is obviously an oversimplification, but it seems to work on a metaphysical level. We start with the comparison and contrast between command-driven interfaces and the magical worldview. I remember when I first sat before a computer, was about 15 years ago, and I, as an English teacher and an English a reader of science fiction, became fascinated with the idea of actually communicating with some other, some mechanical other. So I went to the University Computer Center and sat down and said, I want to interface, even though I didn't know the word at the time, I wanted to experience a computer. And they sat me down before what looked like an electric typewriter and said, go for it. And I sat down and began typing things like, hello computer, and how are you today? And the only response I got was, does not compute, error, error. I found that I asked the technician what was going on, why didn't the computer talk back to me, and he said, you have to learn a language. And I was having difficulty trying to learn Latin at the time, and the last thing I needed was another language course, and so I left the computer center frustrated, realizing that computers weren't for me. Well, maybe 10 years later was my next encounter with a computer, and that was my move from a command-driven interface to a menu-driven interface. What I'd found was the esoteric knowledge you needed to have in order to have an experience of a computer reminded me of the ancient world and the magical worldview in which the shaman had the secret knowledge, and the shaman could somehow control reality through his incantations, and he was the only one that knew that magical language, and he could control the world through his specialized use of esoteric language. I found that I didn't have time to learn the esoteric language, and so I sought other means of accessing knowledge, primarily the library. In the library, unfortunately, I found that the card catalog had been done away with, and instead of a card catalog, there was a computer screen, and I said to myself, oh no, now I'm going to have to learn an esoteric language in order to find the books that I need for my research. Luckily, it was a little bit easier by that time, because instead of an empty teletype machine, I had a screen, and the screen had a menu. Well, menus I was familiar with from restaurants, and I knew I could order various things, so I read the screen, and I could follow the instructions, but then I got to some places that were difficult, and I realized I needed some help, and someone gave me a user's manual. Well, the user's manual was about 300 pages thick, and it was written in that same esoteric kind of language that had frustrated me when I had initially tried to experience a computer. And so the next step in the metaphor was, in my move from command-driven to menu-driven interface, was analogous to the evolution in culture from the magical worldview to the scientific worldview. In other words, no longer does the shaman control the world based on esoteric magical knowledge. Instead, the scientist has the answer. The scientist has the answer based on scientific methodology, and to learn the language of science, we must again seek the library and seek the user's manuals that will explain the world to us in scientific terms. Again, these scientific terms were full of jargon, a little bit easier, at least there wasn't the mystery of magic, but still it was quite frustrating. The analogy that I'm developing is that the programmer, the computer programmer, is analogous to the shaman in that he manipulates computer language the same way that the shaman used incantation. The computer operator, however, using a manual that he reads, is analogous to the scholar within the scientific world, the professor who is the repository of knowledge and passes that knowledge through publication and through books and logic. But now comes the big leap. The big leap is to the icon-driven interface. When I first was given a Macintosh, I was delighted to see that there was, instead of a list of menu items, there were pictures on the screen, pictures that made sense in the real world. I could interact with the icons the same way I interact with physical objects in the real world. When I want to throw away a paper that I'm dissatisfied with, I throw it in my trash can. Well, that's exactly what happens on the screen of the Macintosh. The little images respond to my actions when I move the mouse about in the same sort of way that the real world responds when I move my physical body around. Now, the implication of that fascinated me, though, particularly because I'd been reading some essays about what has come to be known as virtual reality. Virtual reality is a computer interface that is usually, it's in the experimental stages right now, but what happens is the computer generates a version of the world in which we can have a physical experience of actually moving around in that world in 3 dimensions. In other words, if I stood up, the images that I would be perceiving through the computer user interface, and this is in a very rudimentary stage now. They're made up of goggles that one wears with a rubber suit, and the rubber suit is filled with fiber optic technology that registers within the computer the movements of the body. But basically what happens is the computer generates a version of the world. Well, this reminded me of the way Ralph Waldo Emerson described the physical universe in his Transcendental Philosophy. And he said that undoubtedly we have no questions to ask which are unanswerable. We must trust the perfection of the creation so far as to believe that whatever curiosity the order of things has awakened in our mind, the order of things can satisfy. In other words, our curiosity about the world of nature can be answered by nature, according to Emerson. And in virtual reality, whatever we don't understand about the computer, the answer should reside within the computer, not within a user manual, not within an esoteric body of information that we must memorize before sitting down at the machine. But just as in Ralph Waldo Emerson's Transcendental Universe, the answer is there if we look hard enough. Every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. I think it's significant that that Emerson uses the word hieroglyphic, because a hieroglyphic is analogous to an icon, and this icon-driven interface has the answer embedded within the image. He acts it as life before he apprehends it as truth. In like manner, nature is already, in its forms and tendencies, describing its own design. Let us interrogate the great apparition that shines so peacefully around us. Let us interrogate that great apparition. What virtual reality does is create a great apparition. In other words, a consensual hallucination. The term virtual reality is known as an interface, but it's also known as a kind of a fantasy world. It's called cyberspace by some science fiction authors, but the key idea is contained within the word virtual. And the definition of virtual, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is not physically existing as such, but made by software to appear to do so, from the point of view of the program or the user. In other words, it's an illusion, but it's an illusion that functions as real. And so what I've attempted to do in the virtual reality is take some of the implications of the computer network, the fact that information is becoming more and more easy to access through a modem and a telephone line. We can access complete libraries, we can access abstracts of scholarly articles, we can have conversations with one another internationally, and finally, the difficulty is, how do we get there? How do we move into this virtual world? What I have demonstrated here on the screen is a map of the international connections of Usenet. These are the roadways of the virtual world. From my office, I can travel these roadways. I can interact with both human beings and other computers. I can not only access information, but have a sense of a world community. The experience of that world community was described by John Perry Barlow in an article in the Whole Earth Review, Crime and Puzzlement. He says, computer networks are used by corporations to transmit memoranda and spreadsheets, universities to disseminate research, and a multitude of factions from apiarists to Zoroastrians for the purposes unique to each. Whether by one telephonic trindle or millions, they are all connected to one another. Collectively, they form what their inhabitants call the net. It extends across that immense region of electronic states, microwaves, magnetic fields, light pulses, and thought, which science fiction writer William Gibson named cyberspace. Cyberspace in its present condition has a lot in common with the 19th century West. It is vast, unmapped, culturally and legally ambiguous, verbally terse unless you happen to be a court stenographer, hard to get around in and up for grabs. Large institutions already claim to own the place, but most of the actual natives are solitary and independent, sometimes to the point of sociopathy. It is, of course, a perfect breeding ground for both outlaws and new ideas about liberty. It is also the perfect ground for education. What excites me about the notion of cyberspace and the notion of virtual reality is it changes the role of the teacher, the role of the scholar, the role of the professor from a person who is a repository of knowledge to a true adventurer. In other words, I can take my students and in a micro lab filled with microcomputers and a modem, we can enter this cybernetic world. My students and I are frontiersmen. We're entering a world we have no idea what we may find, but we can explore the various avenues. Now, exploring those avenues changes the relationship between student and teacher. No longer am I preaching wisdom, I'm helping the students find their way through the network. In the science fiction world, the cyberpunk metaphor has become a metaphor that is used by game players. It has been used by science fiction enthusiasts. In this illustration, we have a picture of what's called a cyber deck. In the cyber deck, you enter into the network not by viewing a scene and not by wearing glasses, but by physically plugging your brain into the network. When you plug your brain into the network, you enter what William Gibson calls a consensual hallucination. Cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, by children being taught mathematical concepts, a graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system, unthinkable complexity, lines of light ranged in non-space of the mind, clusters of constellations of data like city lights receding. Well, of course, this is science fiction. We don't have cyberspace yet. We don't have a virtual reality. But we do have some experiments. On the screen here is an illustration of one of the experiments which is going on right now. This is a cyber suit. The cyber suit is made up of a pair of goggles known as iPhones, and these goggles are two small color television monitors that are mounted in a headpiece. When the user views the world through these iPhones, he or she doesn't see the actual world, but a computer-generated representation of a three-dimensional world. Since he or she is wearing a cyber suit, this rubber suit filled with fiber optics, the computer generates a version of the body, so that when the user looks at his hands in the world of cyberspace, these hands will move just as his hands move, but instead of being human hands, they could be the wings of an eagle, the flippers of a dolphin, they could be the paws of a monkey. When he looks around in his world, he'll see a representation of the world. Of course, we don't have a lot of sophistication today. Today, it's usually something like a kitchen or an office in which one can pick up a frying pan or answer a telephone. But the idea is the first step we've come to a true cyberspace world. This cyberspace world was developed, as I said before, by William Gibson in Neuromancer in a graphic novel representation of the novel. A graphic novel, by the way, is what we used to call comic books. They're not comic books any longer because they cost $9 to $12, and they have more adult themes. In this comic book, we have the world of cyberspace represented. And here on the screen is an example of the cyber world. Clusters and constellations of data from every computer in the human system, insurance cartels, drug consortiums, the government of Brazil, the pyramid of IBM, in the distance, the spiraling arm of intelligence networks, the matrix unfolding. Of course, this matrix doesn't exist, but the implications of the possibility of a universal computer network does exist. And both the educational and political implications of this world is what intrigued me to investigate it. We're finally in a position, according to French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard, we are finally in a position to understand how the computerization of society affects this problematic. The problematic being the uneven distribution of wealth, the problematic being the class values, the class warfare, and the class conflicts that we're still very much confronted with. He says the answer to these problems is to give the public free access to the memory and data banks. In other words, he sees in the computer network a possibility of regeneration, a possibility of a true democratization of knowledge. It reminds me of what Benjamin Franklin said of the library. He said, the books were imported. The library was open one day in the week for lending them to subscribers on their promissory notes to pay double the value if not duly returned. The institution soon manifested its utility, was imitated by other towns and other provinces. The libraries were augmented by donations. Reading became fashionable, and our people, having no public amusements to divert their attention from study, became better acquainted with books. And in a few years were observed by strangers to be better instructed and more intelligent than people of the same rank generally were in other countries. Benjamin Franklin's foundation of the public library I see as analogous to the possibility of having a computer database which is publicly and internationally accessible. I would like to introduce the metaphor of the virtual library. The virtual library, on one level, introduces students to the physical library in a laboratory setting. It can be a user-friendly interface for online databases. It will include expert systems that aid researchers, and it might be the appropriate cyberspace metaphor. Although I can't take you into cyberspace, I can show you a demonstration of a HyperCard stack that I prepared that uses the virtually real metaphor in the context of the library, the virtual library. Let me take you there. You're in the library. The first screen explains what the virtual library is. It's a hyperdocument that is an online working model of an academic library. This model will enable you to participate in research in a virtually real atmosphere. The interactive, non-hierarchical nature of the system will allow you to decide on the course of your journeys through the virtual library, including actually entering texts, resulting in an experience that simulates the physical research process. You will develop skills in solving research problems, including locating sources, limiting research topics, classifying data, and taking useful notes. I click and we enter the lobby of the library. Notice there is an icon of an X, which is, if we click on it, a map of the library appears. Both the first floor with the library, the primary source stacks, and the second floor, the basement with the electronic systems and the indexes. We can travel back to the lobby and click on the icon of a page that represents a notebook where we can photocopy materials from the library. We can automatically access a list of places we visited printed in bibliographical form. And we can also move physically around by clicking on the down arrow. We go downstairs into the basement. By moving to the right, We enter the electronic data center with a Whole Earth catalog on CD-ROM and a modem access to the Lewis system. We can move back upstairs into the lobby and move into the reading area with the right arrow. The books are represented in the library by an icon of an open book. If I click on that icon, we actually physically enter the stacks. And just as one would in an actual library, we can move to the right, down the stacks, we can move up the shelves of books, and of course we can move back down. On the shelves, if we find a book that we want, we simply click on the Library of Congress label and the book appears, and then by clicking on the book will open. In this case, it's Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and by clicking on the title page, we will move into the first paragraph of that book. Notice that certain words within that first paragraph have been highlighted. They don't have to be highlighted. We can turn that off by clicking on the off switch and just read the paragraph. The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. This is the actual first paragraph from the text. If we wanted to keep it, I would click on the camera and that would photocopy that page and place that page within my notebook by clicking on the icon of the notebook. We travel there and we see here is not only the paragraph itself saved within the notebook, but also the bibliographical information of Capote's text, New York Random House, the page number where the quote came from, and the Library of Congress classification number. All that automatically appears in our list. We can print that when we leave the library if we choose. By turning on the highlighted words within the text, each important word will access additional information. For example, the village of Holcomb. If I click on Holcomb, we move to a small map of Kansas. There's Garden City, Holcomb, so that we can have a geographical location. If back at the text I click on something like ranch hand nasalness, whoops, that was an error. If we click on the text, it'll open again, I hope. Here we have clusters of grain elevators. Clicking on that, there's a representation of grain elevators, and I can go back to the text. The clusters of grain elevators are compared to Greek temples, and so the Greek temples I can also look at, and we have a bibliographical reference here from Great Architecture of the World. These pictures, grain elevators, Holcomb, the Greek temples, can also be photocopied. If we move back to the Greek temples and I touch the camera, there's a photocopy of the Greek temples, which is also registered in the notebook. It takes a while for the imagery to be saved, and therefore we have the icon of the watch. We can also have sound. In the middle of this paragraph by Capote, the local accent is barbed with a prairie twang, a ranch hand nasalness. By clicking on that, we're taken to a screen which explains that click the button here for an illustration of the prairie twang accent found around Holcomb, Kansas. This recording is an excerpt from Richard Brooks' film version of In Cold Blood. Brooks used real citizens from Holcomb to play minor roles. Here, the town postmistress asks her daughter why ambulances are going to the Clutters. And if you listen carefully, you can hear this prairie twang. We can turn off the highlighted words and travel back to the shelf. By closing the book, we end up back at the library shelf. By leaving the stacks, we travel back to the reading room. By leaving the reading room, we're back to the lobby, and we've completed a tour of the virtual library. If I click on the exit, we have the last screen, and the last screen gives you a number of possibilities. We can print whatever notes we've taken. We can print a list of the text copied. We can print the text themselves, or we can click on the quick button, and that leaves HyperCard, and we're back to the world. Although this is a rudimentary, virtually real example, we have had the kind of experience that a student can be introduced to the various possibilities of routes throughout the library. But more than that, we're introduced to a metaphor which shows us that we don't have to be technologists to use computers. We don't have to be mathematically inclined. We don't have to learn esoteric languages. What we can do is respond to the imagery on the screen just as we respond to the real world, and I think there can be a true educational revolution, a true democratization of knowledge through the computer access of the international databases. Thank you.